Today I'll talk about a very simple topic, but probably one of the most pertinent topics in Islamic finance. A topic that I feel is not very well understood, and understanding of it would help in developing a proper understanding of Islamic finance. So all of us understand what is riba, how is riba neutralized, and how we create alternative Islamic finance products. But I want to talk about why is riba prohibited, and how do we explain, how do we theorize, how do we explain the idea of prohibition of riba. So at LUMS, we have been involved in different research projects, and there's a research project in which we theorize, we tried to understand why is riba prohibited. And the idea that we proposed, we argued that to understand the prohibition of riba, you have to understand the economics of law. And we argued that there are two kinds of prohibitions, what we call an act-based prohibition and a harm-based prohibition. What do I mean by the two? So harm-based prohibition is that something is prohibited after it causes a harm to society. So for example, in the West, I argued that alcohol is also prohibited. But the form of prohibition that the West follows with regards to alcohol is harm-based prohibition. So the act of consuming alcohol is not prohibited, but if consumed in excess and a person ends up committing a crime, that crime is punished. Hence, the prohibition still remains. So there are laws related to drink driving. Most of these can be referred to as harm-based prohibition. From an Islamic angle, in most cases we follow what we call an act-based prohibition. So if I talk about alcohol, irrespective of whether a person gets drunk and whether a person ends up causing a harm to society, the act itself is prohibited. In many cases in the Western law as well, there are many examples of act-based prohibition that they follow. So for example, this whole idea of stopping on a traffic light, this is a clear-cut example of what we call an act-based prohibition. So the idea, what is the biggest hikmah, what is the biggest purpose of these traffic laws? The bigger purpose is orderly management of the traffic. So now, if, let's say, at night someone is traveling and there is no traffic, and a person can, with absolute certainty, the person is clear that there would be no traffic. Still, if the traffic light is red, a person has to stop. A person cannot violate that law. Why? Because the essence is it's an act-based prohibition and not a harm-based prohibition. We have argued that interest is also, from an Islamic angle, an act-based prohibition. What do I mean by that? Let me explain it a bit further. So if I assume the perspective of the borrower, a borrower is manipulated and a borrower is exploited at higher rates of interest. So at lower rates of interest, a borrower is well off. But at higher rates of interest, the borrower is exploited. So like consumption of alcohol in excess, we've argued in this work that we are performing, that irrespective of the fact that the borrower is only exploited at higher rates of interest, Islam has prescribed that in a debt contract, the act-based prohibition of interest would apply. There is another greater wisdom that we see on why interest is not just prohibited at higher rates, but interest is also prohibited at lower rates. That wisdom is financial exclusion. So if there was interest was on the lower side, then the market would only have lent to people who were what we call risky borrowers. So people who where probability of default was extremely low. So we have argued that the optimal is that you abolish the whole idea of interest-based lending and you make interest a charitable contract. So the only one of the Islamic alternatives, and that is very much encouraged worldwide, is the idea of interest of lending as a charitable contract, and that is something that we are encouraging, and hopefully as Islamic finance progresses, we would find that the commercial channels of intermediation would move to risk sharing, while debt would be employed in more of a charitable perspective, where people would lend based on Qard Hasan and where people would lend based on benevolent purposes rather than for commercial purposes.